Hello, welcome back. So to part two of our session on J.S. Bach and Baroque music. So I'll just go back into the PowerPoint presentation that I'd prepared. Just bear with me. I'm sure I'll be quicker at this in due course. There we go. Hopefully that works. All right, so now we're going to move slightly northeast geographically in terms of Germany to the point when Bach was appointed Kapellmeister and Director of Chamber Music to the Prince of Anhalt-Köthen. And he served here between 1717 and 1723. The prince here happened to be what's known as a Calvinist, which means that he didn't specifically want music composed for the princely chapel, which of course included organ music as well as vocal music. So therefore, during this period, Bach wrote a lot of what we call secular instrumental music, especially for the harpsichord and clavichord. The clavichord is like a small mini piano that composers often used to take with them when they were traveling, so that they had an instrument to practice on. Secular music basically means non-religious music. And one of the most significant pieces that Bach composed during this time was the collection of preludes and fugues called the Well-Tempered Clavier. A lot of you might have played these when you were first learning, especially if you've learned piano. You might well have played some of these as part of your early music education. Bach wrote two complete sets of these, one whilst he was living in Köthen and the other later on. So prelude and fugue was a very common pairing during the Baroque period. The first is improvised in style, the prelude, and the second one is very structured, just like the toccata and fugue in D minor that we just heard. And each book of the Well-Tempered Clavier presented one of these pairings in each of the 24 keys. So Bach works through C major, then C minor, C sharp major, C sharp minor, D major, D minor, etc., etc. You don't need to worry too much about what well-tempered means for the moment, but first of all, let's just hear one of these pairs. The first prelude and fugue of Book 1 in C major, which, as I said, many of you may well be familiar with from your music education already. So that was just a little bit of the prelude. So now let's hear the end of the prelude and the whole of the fugue, and you can hopefully hear how all the different parts weave together to create a whole piece of music, if you like. So now the fugue. Now, of course, hopefully you agree that that's really great music, but it's also instructional music or educational music. Up to a point, Bach's educational philosophy was that you should learn by doing. In other words, learn music by playing these pieces, such as the Prelude and Fugue that we just listened to. And by doing so, young budding musicians like yourselves, but obviously back in the 18th century, could improve their knowledge of keyboard technique and of how to compose music, especially fugues. And here's a quote from Bach about these pieces. He wrote that they were for the profit and use of musical youth, desirous of learning, and especially for the pastime of those already skilled in this study. So Bach, in fact, wrote a number of other teaching pieces during this time, many of which have now become immortalized in what we now call the Anna Magdalena Notebook. Bach wrote this for his second wife, and it was kind of a kind gesture to the woman that went on to bear him 13 children and who raised the 4 children surviving from the original 7 whom Bach had had with his first wife. So we're going to hear a piece from it called a minuet. And a minuet was a very popular type of piece in the 18th century. So when you listen to it, hopefully you can notice that there's 3 beats in a bar. It's in 3 time. A minuet was a courtly, aristocratic dance, but many purely instrumental minuets were written just for playing and listening to. And they're usually short and simple compositions. So if you were learning to compose in the 18th century, you would have started by learning to write pieces in this kind of style. This example may well be familiar to you. I expect if you've ever started to learn the piano or heard other people doing so, you may well have heard this piece. So pieces based on dance styles were very common at this time, and they were often collected into little groups known as dance suites, and many composers in the Baroque period wrote dance suites. So in these dance suites, each movement would have the structure and the type of rhythm used in the particular dance that it was exemplifying. But it's important to remember that most of them are just abstract instrumental compositions that were designed to be played and listened to. So most of the time you couldn't really dance to any of these. These weren't written to have a room packed full of people dancing to. And Bach wrote many of his dance suites whilst he was working for the Prince in Curtain. Of course, he wrote them for keyboard, but he also wrote them for cello, for the violin, for the flute, and also for the lute. And sometimes he even recycled the pieces that he wrote for one instrument by configuring them for another instrument. And some of his lute suites are simply recycled from other instruments. So we're going to take a closer look at one of his suites, and I'm going to focus now on the cellists amongst the group. I know there's quite a lot of cellists in the Academy this year, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about Bach's cello suites. So for the solo cello, Bach wrote six suites, each with 6 movements. A prelude, an allemande, which is a sort of a moderate speed, a courante, which is fast, a sarabande, which is slow, and then 2 either minuets, bourrées, or gavottes, which are lively, and a gigue, which is a a jig, basically, normally in 6/8. So you may well have heard this one. This is one of his most famous pieces for cello music, the Prelude to Suite No. 1 in G major. But I'd like to actually play you something else today, because we've already heard a minuet and quite a lot of faster music. So I'm going to play you the Sarabandi from the Fifth Suite in C minor. And it's really quite incredible how Bach can make a single line, how moving Bach can make just a single line of music. So it's deeply contemplative music. Now, many of these dance suites are French in origin, and that kind of reflects the cosmopolitanism in Europe at this time. Although Bach didn't travel far, like I said, he basically spent his whole life in Germany, and the only time he really traveled was when he went to see Buxtehude at that one time. Just like most composers in Europe in the Baroque period, Bach got to know the music of other musicians elsewhere on the continent. And what he actually did was he acquired manuscript copies of music by other composers, such as Vivaldi, and he simply copied them out. And that was how he became familiar with the next genre of instrumental music that I want to briefly look at. The concerto. Now, this is a big topic in music, and a lot of you may well have already played a concerto, and I'm sure most of you will do at some point in the near future. So it has quite a different meaning in various contexts. They originated in Italy, and Bach, of course, was very much aware of the concertos by the Italian composer Antonio Vivaldi, amongst others. We'll talk about piano concertos and violin concertos again when I perhaps do a class on classical music or romantic music. So I'm going to look at a couple of Baroque examples with you today. We often think of the concerto as a piece of music for solo instrument plus orchestra, and that does apply a lot of the time, but that's not the only type. There are also concertos that feature a small group of soloists alongside an orchestra. So the first type I described is called a solo concerto, whilst the second type is called a concerto grosso, which basically means concerto for a big group. I'm being a little bit broad brushed in applying these terms this way, and if you do want to do a bit of reading about it, you'll need to add a bit of detail to these definitions, but that's essentially the difference. So both types of concerto, as you can see on the screen here, feature a contrast between different musical forces. In solo concertos, it's the contrast between a soloist and an orchestra. This we term solo, i.e. one instrument, and tutti, meaning everybody. In a concerto grosso, different groups of instruments contrast with each other. Usually a small group that's called a concertino, and a large group that's called a ripieno. So Bach wrote a set of concertos for a diverse range of instruments, and these are known as the Brandenburg concertos. So there's 6 in the set, and each has a different instrumentation. And I'm going to play you an example from his second concerto in the set, which is a concerto grosso. So there are 4 soloists, a trumpet, oboe, recorder, sometimes the recorder can be replaced by the flute, and violin. Sometimes they play alone, sometimes the instruments play together, and sometimes they play along with the orchestra that's made up of strings and a continuo section. The way Bach has structured this piece, which is typical of the Italian style, is by using what we call orchestral ritornellos. So this means that after each little bracket of solo playing, the orchestra returns for another short burst that they're all playing all together. Ritornello actually means little return. And hopefully you can see what I mean from this diagram. So we have a ritornello section first, where all the orchestra are playing. Then we have a solo instrument. Then we come back to the ritornello. Then 2 other solo instruments join together. Then we come back to the ritornello. Then 2 more different solo instruments. Then the ritornello, etc., etc. So have a listen to this and see if you can follow that diagram and spot when the ritornello sections happen and when the solo instruments come in. And the success of concertos, such as the Brandenburg concertos, helped to rise the prominence of the orchestra, which became perhaps the most important medium that would dominate composers' outputs throughout certainly the second half of the 18th century. And of course, the orchestra became central to music beyond then too. I'm going to come out of this now. Back to the video. So that's the end of our first session, really. So we've looked at what Baroque music is, what some of the important features, how you might recognize a piece of Baroque music. I've told you a little bit about J.S. Bach's life certainly in the first half of his life. And I've hopefully pointed out some examples of music that he wrote. Some of them are famous, some of them not so well known, how he was an important music educator. And next time, we'll look at the last part of his life when he was based in the city of Leipzig in in East Germany, and what he did there. And then we'll move on to looking at another important composer from the Baroque period, Georg Friedrich Handel, and how his music differs quite considerably from that of J.S. Bach. So I hope this has helped. Like I said at the beginning, if there's any questions, suggestions, issues, anything that comes up, this was very much experimental, please email Wolfgang and I'll be very happy to hear from any of you. So I hope you've enjoyed the videos and learned something from them, and I'll see you all again on Zoom next week. Thank you and have a good day. Bye-bye.